Hi everyone, Mike Fevola from Inolex here, and thanks for tuning into my presentation and update on silicone alternatives in hair care. In this presentation, I'll review some of the current state of the art in this class of ingredients that continue to become more and more important in the hair care category. Look forward to sharing some insights with you, and hopefully we'll have a lively discussion in the Q&A. So here's a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. Before we get into talking about silicone alternatives themselves, we need to spend a little bit of time talking about silicones and the underlying chemistry that causes them to function the way that they do. We'll also look at why people are seeking alternatives for silicones, given that they work so well, and we'll then move on to talking about some of the silicone alternative ingredients, some of the principles behind their design, and how they can be implemented into silicone-free formulations. So why silicones in the first place? To understand how this category of ingredients became so prevalent and so widely used in the hair care category, we need to take a look at their chemistry and understand some of the unique properties that result in their beneficial performance. So to understand why silicones are so unique, we really need to start at the molecular level. In fact, we have to start at the atomic level. So if you look at the structure of polydimethylsiloxane on the right, you'll see that silicones are polymers of silicon and oxygen. Those form the backbone of the polymer. And then the silicon atoms are substituted with methyl groups containing carbon and hydrogen. Now, because silicon is a larger and less electronegative atom than carbon, the bonds between silicon and oxygen and carbon tend to be longer and more flexible compared to traditional organic molecules where you just have carbon-carbon or carbon-oxygen bonds. The result of this is that you have more rotational freedom and flexibility in a silicone polymer than you would in a traditional organic polymer. Now, when we couple that rotational freedom and that conformational flexibility with the fact that your backbone is substituted with very hydrophobic methyl groups, this results in these polymers having a very low intermolecular attraction with themselves and with any other materials that they come in contact with. This results in silicones being very hydrophobic and having a very low surface energy. Because they have a low surface energy, they're able to spread very easily. They really don't have much attraction between the surfaces that they're applied to, so they can spread easily. And because they have that molecular rotational freedom and conformational freedom, it makes it even easier for them to slide past one another and spread on surfaces. Now, another consequence of that weak intermolecular attraction between the silicone polymers is the fact that films formed by silicones have very high permeability. It's very easy for gases like oxygen and water vapor to diffuse through a film of silicone because they can just, easily wiggle through these very flexible polymer chains. Finally, another interesting thing about silicones is that they have very high thermal stability, which is due to the strength of that oxygen-silicon bond. This becomes very important in hair care when we look at products for high heat applications. So for example, products that accompany hair straightening processes that are used with very high temperatures, like straightening irons. The reason those formulations work is because of the high thermal stability and the low surface energy of the silicone molecule. So with that understanding of silicone chemistry in mind, let's take a look at the jobs that silicones do in hair care formulations. So because of their ability to spread very easily on surfaces and impart a low surface energy coating on fibers, they're typically applied to the hair to help lubricate the fibers and reduce the comb force on those fibers. So the lubrication assists with the ability of fibers to rub past one another without much friction, and it also reduces the friction associated with running a comb or a brush through the hair. This lubricity that comes from the low surface energy of the silicones ultimately imparts a soft feel to the hair, which is very desirable to consumers. And it also provides a protective but breathable barrier on the hair surface. So that includes everything from thermal protection to color protection. Also, because of that low surface energy and hydrophobic characteristics of the film, the silicones can impart some humidity resistance to the hair because it's very difficult for atmospheric moisture to wet the hair fiber and absorb into it when it has a silicone coating on it. And finally, because of their high refractive index, silicones are able to enhance the shine of hair and give it a more lustrous appearance. So if silicones are such wonderfully functional ingredients and impart all of these consumer desirable benefits to products, it begs the question, why are so many products attempting to go silicone-free? Why are there so many products being introduced into the market with silicone-free claims? And to give you an example of what I'm talking about, there's some data here from the Mintel Global New Products Database that just shows the dramatic rise over the past 2 decades in the number of products that are being launched with a silicone-free claim. So this move away from silicones really comes down to 3 interrelated factors that are environmentally oriented, consumer oriented, and regulatory oriented. In the case of the environmental concerns around silicones, it's known that silicone production is very energy intensive and it requires non-renewable feedstocks, and also most of the energy that's used to manufacture silicones is not renewable either. So there's a very large environmental footprint associated with the sourcing and manufacture of the silicone ingredients themselves. The other environmental concern is that at the end of life of a silicone ingredient, it's most likely going to wind up going down the drain or being released into the environment. And once it's there, it doesn't biodegrade. So you have a very high potential for environmental persistence as well as bioaccumulation if the silicone starts to make its way into the food chain. So these environmental concerns have driven regulatory action. Most notably in the European Union, cyclomethacones have been effectively banned in cosmetics by way of restriction. So the use of cyclomethacones like D5 are restricted to practically, useless levels in cosmetic products. And there's also pending regulatory action for further restriction of the linear volatile dimethacones. These include things like trisiloxane and hexamethyl disiloxane. And in response to that, retailers are also beginning to ban certain silicones on their shelves, particularly the dimethacones that are the cyclomethacones that are prohibited by regulation. The net effect of this, of course, also makes consumers have concerns. Now, in terms of consumer concern, some of it is grounded around safety concerns, which are largely unfounded. Silicones, by and large, have been demonstrated to be safe, and they enjoy a long track record of safety, not only in consumer products, but also in pharmaceuticals and medical devices. Nevertheless, this creates a halo over silicone ingredients and drives the desire to be silicone-free. So collectively, all of this means that there's a long-term question around the sustainability of silicones as a class of ingredients in cosmetic products. In response to these concerns around silicones and a desire to go silicone-free, we see formulators increasingly adopting silicone alternative ingredients. Now, by definition, if something isn't a silicone, then it can be an alternative, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a good one. So what we'll do in the next section is take a look at what makes a silicone alternative a good one. To give you a feel for the breadth of ingredients that are being deployed as silicone alternatives today, we can take a look at the list here. Naturally occurring oils, of course, are very popular because they're kind of directly isolated from plants. So things like coconut oil have been positioned as silicone alternatives. Emollient fluids, whether they're hydrocarbons or esters, have become very popular. Again, because these have some physical properties that make them very amenable to silicone substitution. And of course, mixtures of any of the fluids shown here have been also deployed as silicone alternatives. And then when it comes to more viscous materials and trying to substitute for things like dimethicone, we see viscous fluid polymers being deployed as alternatives. So polyethers and polyesters are particularly popular for this purpose. So in order to develop a successful silicone alternative, you really need to approximate the physical properties of the silicone that you're trying to replace. So there's kind of a base case for silicones. We want to have chemistry for the alternatives that has things like the low surface energy, the spreadability, the hydrophobicity, all those kind of characteristics that are inherent to silicones. But then there's typically also additional key physical properties that we need to ensure the alternative can approximate. For example, cyclopentasiloxane, that has all of the lubricity and spreadability and low surface energy of silicones, but those are also volatile. They're able to evaporate very easily. So when we develop an alternative for cyclopentasiloxane, we want to use ingredients that will give the volatility either directly or the perception of volatility by having a light dry feel so that we can effectively substitute for cyclopentasiloxane. In the case of dimethicone, the key physical property there is the viscosity. That's in addition to the lubricity and the surface spreadability. We also want to have some resistance to flow. So there is a case where we want to use esters and polymers to build some viscosity into those fluids. For the more specialized silicones, if we take amodimethicone as an example, amodimethicone is an amine-containing silicone so that it has some cationic character, which makes it substantive to hair and skin. So for those alternatives, we need to have still a low surface energy hydrophobic material, but it also needs to have a cationic charge associated with it to drive that substantivity and deposition. So for that purpose, we've deployed polyester amines, which are polyesters that have a cationic nitrogen in the backbone to help approximate the physical properties of dimethicone in performance. And finally, for aromatic silicones like phenyltrimethicone, those are used predominantly to enhance the shine of hair, and that physical property that's at work there is their high refractive index. So when we develop substitutes that'll also have that shine benefit, we're looking for high refractive index organic fluids, and in this case we typically use aromatic esters such as propylene glycol dibenzoate. So as a chemist, I'm usually very interested in what's going on at the molecular level because understanding the structure-property relationships there will help identify suitable chemistries that make good silicone alternatives. So if we take the case of cyclopentasiloxane, we have a very flexible ring-like silicone that's decorated with many methyl groups. So when we look at suitable substitutes, isododecane is a good candidate because it has a lot of methyl groups, and because of the branching in that molecule, those methyl groups can be positioned in all directions, resulting in a fluid with a low surface tension and very poor intermolecular interactions with itself and other substrates. Similarly, for a neopentyl glycol diheptanoate, we see the methyl groups there and a lot of branching as well. And again, collectively, having fluids with the branching and the high methyl group substitution enables them to stay fluids down to very low temperatures and to have that low surface energy that's required for effective silicone substitution. A good example here is heptyl undesolinate. This is a molecule that we call LexFeel Natural. If we draw the structure of heptyl undesolinate, most people would draw the straight stick figure that you see here. But if we think about the conformation that this molecule actually adopts in its fluid state, it's probably more like the quasi-cyclic structure I've shown at the bottom. Heptyl and desolenate has a terminal alkene group that's very electron-rich, and that electron-rich group can then interact with the electron-deficient carbon of the ester carbonyl and form this quasi-cyclic structure. That in turn presents a lot of aliphatic carbon to whatever surface this is touching, and helps also impart a low surface energy and good spreadability of the heptyl and desolenate fluid. One of the earliest innovations at Inolex in the area of silicone alternatives was the development of cyclomethicone alternatives based on ester hydrocarbon blends. And these are particularly important because they have a synergistic benefit that occurs when you mix an ester with a hydrocarbon. So if you take a look at the table here, you can see I've listed several esters, hydrocarbons, and then the blends. And if we look at the column where we have surface tension listed, you'll see that the esters generally have higher surface tension values than the hydrocarbons. This is important when it comes to hair care because esters, even though they're hydrophobic, they have more polar characteristics, which makes them more compatible with the hair surface. Hair is, of course, composed of protein. It's hydrophobic, but it does have more polar characteristics. So you have good compatibility between the fluid and the substrate, which results in good wetting or good contact of the fluid on that substrate. In contrast, if we look at the hydrocarbons, they have lower surface tensions, which is great for spreading because you have those very weak intermolecular interactions that allow the fluid to spread very readily. However, there's very poor compatibility or wetting between hydrocarbons and the hair surface. So by combining an ester and a hydrocarbon, you can synergistically improve the ability of the resulting fluid to both wet the hair but still provide a low surface energy as measured by surface tension. Another benefit of combining esters and hydrocarbons is that the resulting fluids have a lower interfacial tension with water compared to the hydrocarbon by itself. So this helps improve emulsion stability. Basically, your emulsifier isn't going to have to work as hard to hold that emulsion together because of the interfacial tension reduction by the ester. And finally, by having hydrocarbons as a component of these fluids, you're still able to get some of that volatility that's characteristic of something like D5 cyclopentasiloxane. Nevertheless, once that hydrocarbon flashes off, you still have a light dry ester left behind that'll give a good perception of volatility by having a light dry feel. So the first generation of products that we introduced were based on petro-derived ingredients, neopenyl glycoldiheptanoate and isododecane. More recently, we've been able to develop 100% bio-based hydrocarbon ester mixtures. So those bio-based hydrocarbon ester mixtures are sold under our LexFeel Wow name. The hero product there, LexFeel Wow, is a combination of the ester triheptanoin, which is derived from castor-based feedstocks, with a fermentation-derived hydrocarbon C13-16 isoalkane. And now, by going this route, we've replaced the petro content with what we believe is a more sustainable alternative and still retain the benefits of the ester hydrocarbon blend, which give it equivalent performance to cyclopentasiloxane. To demonstrate the suitability of the LexFeel Wow ester hydrocarbon mixture as an alternative to cyclopentasiloxane, we've examined its performance in several different applications areas. Probably the most rigorous was the examination of the Wow product in a hair serum formulation. Hair serums tend to have very high silicone loadings, so this is really kind of an extreme case for silicone substitution. But when we did the substitution for D5, we found that the LexFeel Wow could give comparable performance on all aesthetic measures for that hair serum product. We compared LexFeel WOW to cyclopentasiloxane in a more traditional format, a rinse-off conditioner based on cationic surfactant fatty alcohol conditioning system, we see that in both instrumental measures and in consumer sensory measures, we get equivalent performance between the two materials. So in the case of, this is showing wet comb data and wet conditioning subjective data, we see equivalent performance between D5 and LexFeel WOW. And that performance also carried through into the dry state. So we have equivalent dry comb force reduction and additional equivalency on the sensory attributes once the hair is dry. Another area where we've been very intentional in our ingredient design is the LexFeel N Series. LexFeel N is a series of 100% bio-based dimethicone alternatives that we obtain by combination of a low molecular weight ester, diheptylsuccinate, with a higher molecular weight biodegradable polyester, capryl glycerin sebacic acid copolymer. When we combine these components in varying ratios, we're able to target dimethicones of particular viscosities and give fluids with equivalent viscosity and equivalent physical properties to dimethicone. One of the physical properties of dimethicone that we were most interested in conserving was spreadability. So you can see that for all of the various viscosities of LexFeel N series, we've compared the spreadability to a dimethicone of comparable viscosity, and you can see that we mimic the spreadability very well. So we, again, impart very similar physical properties in an effort to develop a suitable dimethicone alternative. And when we have those similar physical properties, we're able to achieve comparable performance. So in this case, we evaluated LexFeel N350 in a traditional rinse-off hair conditioner, and what we saw is that we had equivalent wet combing performance to a dimethicone of equal viscosity. Another interesting benefit of LexFeel N350 is its ability to deliver a color protection benefit on color-treated hair. To demonstrate this, we created a conditioner containing LexFeel N350 and then used it in wash and condition cycles on color-treated hair. And what we observed is that after 10 cycles of shampooing and conditioning the hair, we saw a conservation of the hair color with a delta E greater than 1, which meant that that color change would be detectable to the human eye. We believe that this benefit is attributed to the kind of coating of the hair fiber with the ester polyester fluid. That film, after conditioning, helps leave behind a protective layer so that on subsequent wash cycles, the surfactant isn't able to attack the hair and leach the color out as readily. That conditioning layer actually acts as a sacrificial substrate to protect the hair from surfactant. Now that we've talked about alternatives at the ingredient level and how we identify suitable alternatives, we'll talk a little bit about silicone-free formulations. When attempting to formulate without silicones, perhaps the most important question to ask yourself is, what is the job of the formula? This is something that I call functional analysis. If we ask ourselves what the job of the formula is, we can then take a step back and go to deeper levels and understand what's going to be required both at the ingredient level and at the formulation level to do the job that product is intended for. When it comes to reformulating existing products that contain silicone, it's a little trickier. You need to understand the role that the silicone was playing in that formulation and what its function was. And then once you have an adequate understanding of what the silicone was doing, that'll help you understand what alternative should you seek out. Should you seek something that's a cyclomethicone alternative because it has volatility, or should you be seeking something like a amodimethicone because it has substantivity? So like a polyestyramine, for example. Not only do you need to ensure that your substitution ingredients are going to deliver the benefit, but you also need to have a look at the rest of the formula to understand what taking the silicone out of the formulation is going to do to the formulation. For example, if you remove a silicone, is it going to change the HLB of the emulsion? And might you need to adjust your emulsifier package to maintain stability? Or if you remove the silicone and the viscosity changes, are you going to need to increase fatty alcohol content or other thickener content to make up for the lost viscosity? So pulling a silicone out of an existing formulation is probably a little trickier than just developing a silicone-free formulation from scratch. In the latter case, you're a little better off because you're starting with a blank sheet of paper. And there you just still need to ask yourself, what's the job of the formula? And then understand what are the mechanisms of action that are you going to deploy to get that job done. And that'll help you identify which ingredients to select for that purpose. So I'll use detangling sprays as a simple example of kind of this functional analysis approach. Detangling sprays are very thin fluids that are typically sprayed onto wet hair to make for easier combing. These products are in fact a lifesaver. When my daughters were little, after bath time and it was time to comb their hair, I don't know how I would have gotten the knots out if it wasn't for these types of products. Anyway, if we look at the ingredient formulations, we see that the performance is largely driven by quaternary cationic species, either cationic surfactants or cationic polymer. The cationic surfactants serve to lubricate the hair shaft and particularly get cuticles to lay down and kind of lubricate the fiber, enabling the comb to pass more freely through the hair and get the knots out. We see amodimethicone is also included in there. That amodimethicone, of course, is cationic and substantive to hair, and it's going to assist in that spreading and the lubricity of the formulation on the hair fiber. And of course, it'll remain behind after dry down to help give the hair good dry combability and a nice soft feel. So these would be prime candidates for substitution with a polyestyramine, such as polyester 11 or kerosene MP. And that could be a very easy one-to-one type replacement for the amodimethicone. I say this because we've actually looked at amodimethicone replacement with kerosene MB in the past. In this case, I'm showing some data for a more traditional rinse-off conditioner based on stearimidopropyl dimethylamine. And what we observed in this formulation was when we exchanged amodimethicone for kerosene MB, we actually saw an increase in comb force reduction compared to amodimethicone. So it gives us a very good reason to believe that the amodimethicone in the Detangler spray could be substituted with kerosene MB to make a silicone-free formulation. So more recently, our formulation team developed a silicone-free detangling spray based on our Amino lipid technology. So here was a case where it wasn't a reformulation. They could develop from the ground up, and they chose to deploy two mechanisms of action in this formulation. They used the lubricity of a high molecular weight water-soluble polymer, and they coupled that with a low viscosity cationic liquid crystal dispersion based on our Amino SC product. So basically the way this formula works, when it's sprayed on hair, you have a very lubricious polymer solution based on hydroxypropyl guar that gives you some very good wet comb force reduction that enables the cationic liquid crystal dispersion to be spread on the hair fiber. Now, as that dispersion is spread, those lamellar crystals basically lay out as lamellar sheets of the cationic amino lipid onto the hair fiber. They provide additional lubricity in the wet state, and then upon dry down, they remain there. You have this cationic species absorbed onto the hair to kind of give dry state lubricity as well as a nice soft feel to the hair. So I'll go ahead and wrap up here and give you a few key takeaways. I think we're going to continue to see silicones become less desirable in hair care formulations and more generally in the personal care industry, just because of some of those sustainability concerns as well as the negative perception of safety around these ingredients. As a result of that, the silicone alternatives will continue to become more important. Remember, deploying silicone alternatives requires the use of this functional analysis approach where we ask what's the job to be done. Whether it's in a reformulation or in a ground-up new product development, really having a good understanding of what you're asking the ingredients to do and the benefit that you're attempting to provide will help enable successful development when going silicone-free. I will say it's now been easier than ever to develop silicone-free formulations. There's a number of alternatives in the market that perform very well, and some of the newer formulation approaches that are being introduced enable very effective use of those ingredients to make silicone-free formulations. I think there'll still be some gaps. So for example, in the area of heat protection, I'm not convinced that there's any organic chemistry out there today that can compete with silicone chemistry when it comes to the thermal stability required for effective heat protection, for example, from a straightening iron or a curling iron. So we'll continue to look for innovation in that space to help it close some of those gaps. Finally, I think there's going to be more light at the end of the tunnel as newer consumers enter the market. They're going to have less experience with silicone-based products, so they'll have different expectations than the generations of consumers who've been used to using products based on silicone ingredients. So I think gradually, as those older consumers age out of the market, we'll start to see more acceptance among consumers of silicone-free products. So before I conclude, I just want to say a few thank yous. Thanks to my colleagues at Inolex. Their hard work and dedication makes all of this possible, and I really appreciate the privilege of being able to talk about it on their behalf. So thanks to Team Inolex. Thank you very much to Jen and the EcoWell for inviting me to participate in the summit, and I'll look forward to speaking to you in the Q&A. Thank you.